If you're watching this video, I assume you may well be the tutor who is going to guide your student through Stairway to Spelling. There are some videos to follow which go in conjunction with a lesson guide which I shall be talking about. It's important at this stage, I think, to familiarise yourself with the manual. There is a glossary here which explains some of the terms that we regularly use throughout the manual. On page 16 we have "Before you start." This explains some of the elements of the manual, some of the important elements of the manual. It also refers to two appendices, Appendix 1 and Appendix 2, which can be found here in the flap at the back of Stairway to Spelling. Appendix 1 has six sets of sentences for dictation to your student. Each set of sentences contains 50 of the most used words, so 6 times 50 to make up the 300 most used words. On the flip side, we have Appendix 2, where spelling forms which you will regularly use as you work your way through the manual can be photocopied. 8 of these spelling forms are already provided in the manual. They are perforated and can be torn out. On page 80 we have a lesson guide which I recommend that you follow. The videos which follow go in conjunction with this lesson guide. So how do we assess which students need the book? Well, look out for students who tend to confuse high frequency words. In particular, look out for confusion between where and where, who and how, off and of, for example. Again, any students above the age of 7 who regularly confuse B and D. Look at students' written work. Do they tend to spell phonetically? Are they spelling words the way that they sound? For example, said spelt s-e-d. Students who have low scores on spelling tests may well also benefit from Stairway to Spelling. On page 84 of the manual, we have an optional diagnostic test. This is useful in 2 ways. First of all, by dictating these sentences for your student to write on paper, any students who make a lot of errors, because these sentences contain all 300 most used words, will certainly benefit from the manual. It's also useful in a second way as a final check, so that those students who have been all the way through the manual, learned all 300 most used words, can have a final check to see if there are any words which have slipped through the net. This optional diagnostic test can be downloaded from our website. So I'll now turn to my student Kira, and I'm going to dictate the words from the diagnostic test for her to write down on paper. So here we go, you've got your pen and paper, Kira. Don't spend too long on these words. If you're at all unsure, just put what you think the words sound like. Okay, the first sentence is this one. So it's a capital letter and it goes, how do we learn? To read and spell. There's a question mark. Great. Your next sentence, capital letter, it seems that some people do not have to try very hard. So it's do not have to try very hard. Full stop. So once your student has left the room, you can mark these sentences. It's important to realise that if there are a lot of mistakes, then your student will definitely benefit from Stairway to Spelling. If there are very few errors on the page, then you need to make a judgment about whether your student needs it. However, if you see words that are spelt incorrectly or spelt the way they sound phonetically, then almost certainly your student will benefit from going through the manual. When this is completed, you can then keep it in the flap at the back of the manual, And when the manual has been completed by your student, you can do this diagnostic test again to make a comparison. On our website there's a calculation which will show you the percentage improvement. Stairway to Spelling contains a lesson guide which I recommend that you follow. This lesson guide goes in conjunction with these videos. So the lesson guide begins on page 80 with test 1. The first element is the sentence dictation for the most used words 1 to 50. So take the appendix from the flap at the back of the book and we have the sentences for most used words 1 to 50, which I shall now dictate to my student Kira. She will write these sentences on page 18 of the manual. And there's your pen, Kira, and we'll begin here. So it starts with a capital letter and goes, if one is there, you can get on or off with it. Full stop. Capital letter for your next sentence. Which one can we use for all of it? So when Kira has completed these sentences, we'll return to them and mark them later on. So the next step on the lesson guide on test 1 is to test the reading of the 50 most used words. If you can't read a word, you can't spell it. So if we turn to page 32 of Stairway to Spelling, I'll start the process with my student Kira. I'll put the date at the top, which is the 27th of March. Right, Kira, can you read this word for me, please?
On, had, in, but, off.
That word, Kira, is of. Will you say it after me? Of?
Of.
I'll place a dot in there.
Was, at, would.
This, Kira, is word. Say word, please.
Word, with, are.
After all the words in this column have been ticked or dotted as appropriate, we're then going to work on the negatives, the dotted words which Kira didn't read correctly. To learn them, we apply the sus3 technique. sus3 stands for stare, underline, say 3 times. And I mean underline with your finger, so the tutor underlines with his finger. So this one here, to begin with, Kira, will you say after me, of, 3 times for me?
Of, of, of.
Word.
Word, word, word.
Said.
Said, said, said.
I'll now place a tick in the sus3 box at the bottom. There's 3 grids here. So I'll place a tick in that one and then we repeat the whole process. Okay, once again, staring please. Of.
Of, of, of.
Word.
Word, word, word.
Said.
Said, said.
Place a tick here at the bottom. And a final time. 3 times of.
Of, of, of.
Word.
Word, word, word.
Said.
Said, said, said.
Final time. So those words, those negatives have been practiced 9 times. After a gap of at least a day since the previous Stairway session, we'll now take the next element of the lesson guide on page 80, which is test 2. The first element of this is the list test for the 50 most used words. This appears on page 39 of the manual. On page 39 we have the 50 most used words in lists. You may note that actually there are only 44 words listed here. That's simply because some words which commonly cause problems are already written on our control page. So we give our student Kira a pen and paper. We take the book and we ask Kira to spell the words on paper. So first of all, Kira, if there's any words you're unsure of, you can put a line. The first word I want you to spell is all. So spell all for me, please. An, and, are, as, at, be, as in to be or not to be. Word, you, your. That completes the list test. Once the list test has been completed, you don't need your student anymore for this particular lesson, so your student can now leave the room. So we record the results from the list test, we mark them with a tick or a dot on the paper, and then on page 39, on the column that says list test, we tick or dot as appropriate. Once this is completed, we need to isolate the negatives, isolate the errors. On page 53 of Stareway To Spelling, we have a control page for the most used words 1 to 50. This will guide our students' progress through the manual. So the tutor will write the dotted words, the negatives, in the shaded area of page 53. The next step is to return to our dictated sentences that we did on the previous lesson. Here we underline the errors. Try and do this when your student isn't there to minimise embarrassment. Underline the errors in the sentence test. Turn to page 39 and record the results here in the sentence test column. So we'll tick or dot in the sentence test column. So that any additional errors, by which I mean words which were spelt correctly on the list test but were spelt incorrectly on the sentence dictation, also then need to be transferred to the same control page, page 53, and once again written in the shaded area. If there are more than 8 errors on the control page, turn to page 80 and follow Lesson Guide A. If there are fewer than 8 errors on the control page, I suggest you turn over leaf onto page 82 and follow Lesson Guide B. Lesson Guide B is for stronger students who make fewer errors, and it deals with the most used words in blocks of 100 rather than in blocks of 50, as in Lesson Guide A. Before commencing Lesson 1, it's important that you understand the method we use in order to teach spelling. On page 42 of the manual, we have an explanation of the RAWS process. RAWS stands for read, analyse, write, spell, i.e. read the words, analyse the words, write the words down, spell the words verbally. The first thing you will need is a RAWS spelling form. 8 of these are provided at the back of Stareway To Spelling. They are perforated and can be torn out. Here we have an example of one of them. You will use a lot of these as you work your way through the manual. Once these have been used up, Appendix 2 can be photocopied. If by any chance you lose this appendix, you can go to our website so you can get more forms from that. The most important element of RAWS is A for analyse. This is where we actually engage with our student and discuss the words and the method that student will use in order to remember the spellings. The analysis part of RAWS is crucial. It's what differentiates it from look, cover, write, check, which is commonly used in schools but doesn't help to get the words into the long-term memory. So how do we do this? Well, on page 66 of Stareway To Spelling, we have some golden rules which you can look at before you actually start to do the RAWS process. And over leaf, we have a word guide with all the words listed here in alphabetical order. Opposite the most used words, we have the phonetic spellings, the way that the words sound, and the common errors. And also, opposite the words, where appropriate, we have listed a number of mnemonics or memory aids. It's where we take the letters in a word and we combine them with a familiar saying or phrase. So, for example, for said, we will say said an interesting doctor. Or for does, we will have does Oliver eat sausages. So if I now turn to my student Kira, we've written her name here and the date here. And in row A of the Rose form, there are 8 words which Kira couldn't spell when I tested her. Okay, so the first step in Rose is read. We have to make sure that Kira can read the words before we teach her to spell them. So we'll try reading them. So Kira, what's this word, please?
When, from, said, there.
This word is they. Will you say after me they?
They.
And again they.
They. Are. What. With. Have.
Tell me this word again, please.
They.
They, that's the one. This is where I'm going to engage with my student Kira and help her to try and remember these words. So we'll look at this word here, when. This is how you spelt it, Kira. You spelt it phonetically, n. Now, when is what I refer to as a question word. Now, a question word is a word which on its own is a question. So if I said to you, when, you reply, when what? Because I've asked you a question. You can contrast with another word, went, which isn't a question word and on its own makes no sense. The word guides from page 68 onwards will explain this. You'll find when here and it will show you the phonetic error. Also on page 66, the first of the golden rules is the question word rule, which explains the rule that I'm talking about. To take another example, we'll look at the word said. The mistake that Kira made was to spell the word phonetically, as it sounds, d. Once again, if we use our word guide on page 68, we can locate said. There's the phonetic spelling and the common error. And here's the memory aid mnemonic to remember it. Said an interesting doctor. So, Kira, if you could say after me for said, say said an interesting doctor.
Said an interesting doctor.
Now, could you please write said and say it at the same time? Said.
Said an interesting doctor.
That's perfect. So turning to page 42, we can see that after the analysis element of Rose, we can see the next 2 elements of Rose are write the words down and spell the words verbally. I don't intend to go through any detailed explanation of that at the moment. In lesson 1, the video that follows for lesson 1, you'll see how this works in practice. This relates, of course, to the example here on the facing page. Similarly, with errors, there's an explanation here on page 43 of how we deal with errors. Once again, I won't go into detail with that now. You'll see how that works in practice in the next video for lesson 1.